Welcome to WarPod, a podcast brought to you by SaferWorld, asking experts from around the world about the impact of security policy on contemporary conflict. I'm Charlie Linney, Project Coordinator in the Arms Unit at SaferWorld.
And I'm Jordan Street, Head of the US and UN Programme at SaferWorld USA.
Today, we're going to be speaking about the future of counterterrorism policy at the United Nations.
Now, in 2026, the United Nations will be undertaking the 9th review of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, 20 years on from its initial adoption. A lot has changed since then. At SaferWorld, we've been keeping a close eye on these developments, and we've seen mistakes in counterterrorism policy which have exacerbated conflicts around the world, from Iraq and Afghanistan to Somalia and the Sahel.
We've seen states use counterterrorism policy around the world to silence political opponents, counter dissent, target protesters and activists, and strip individuals of their basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. From Xinjiang to Guantanamo Bay to Gaza, counterterrorism policy and logic have been repeatedly misused and abused to facilitate some of the most egregious violations, both in conflict and non-conflict settings alike.
This is why SaferWorld has always cautioned against the open embrace by the United Nations system of counterterrorism. As regular listeners of WarPod will know, SaferWorld has produced some leading research shedding light on the extent and embrace of counterterrorism at the United Nations. And as a member of the Civil Society Coalition on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, we've worked to transform multilateral policy to prevent some of the most harmful effects.
So today, we've invited two members of that coalition to join us to shed some light on what they see as the major upcoming issues, debates, and fissures facing the UN system when it comes to counterterrorism.
I'm Ambika Satkunanathan, a human rights lawyer from Sri Lanka. I have worked for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on issues related to counterterrorism law and policy, drug policy, prison reform, militarization, police brutality, and transitional justice.
I'm Ali Altok. I'm a doctoral candidate in peace studies and political science at the University of Notre Dame. I study youth politics and I've been long-term engaged in the youth peace and security agenda. My work looks at young people's participation in peace and security. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Ambika, for joining us. So, starting us off, would you be able to tell listeners why counterterrorism policy at the United Nations matters for your work and for the work of the CSO Coalition on Human Rights and Counterterrorism?
Well, counterterrorism policy at the UN matters because we have a global counterterrorism strategy. And that is sort of the foundation that member states use as the framework for their actions at the national level. So, for instance, if by any chance, let's say, gender is not included in the GCTS or the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, that can be used as an excuse by member states to say, hey, when we do counterterrorism work in our national context, we don't actually have to take that into account. So the UN is often, despite the fact that member states reject the UN, they also use the UN as the foundation, as the framework, sometimes as justification and even as excuses, which is why it is critical to engage with what goes on related to counterterrorism in New York.
Absolutely. And that is why SaferWorld has followed this agenda for quite some time. We know that the majority of terror attacks still happen in conflict contexts. And so SaferWorld, as a peacebuilding organization, know that to get conflict policy right is actually the best strategy in preventing violent terror attacks. Hence why we've tried to help promote a better way and better policies at the multilateral level, because we know the impact that negative counterterrorism policies has on human rights, on gender, on conflict, on fundamental freedoms. And that's why we care about this.
Why should we care about UN counterterrorism policy is actually should be answered simply, But UN still matters. That's at least what I think. I think we don't have a better organization to manage international relations. That's what we need to sort of value. Although UN has its own flaws, this is the best we have in our hands, like democracy, So what we see is in the last 30 years, I would say, the research we have done shows that, governments around the world started using UN to develop international policy frameworks that can be used in their national legislation or national security sector to repress political dissent, repress opposition, shut down opposition. So that's why I think the UN counterterrorism really matters, because the way states use this policy agendas goes beyond like how the state is run. It has an impact on individual lives, individual people. What happened is that in the last 20 years, especially after 9/11, is that states used UN as a platform for developing like international counterterrorism policy frameworks. These policy frameworks had like a downstream impact, whether it's in Sri Lanka or it's in the Philippines. These policy frameworks that are branded with UN logo has been used by the governments to repress political dissent. When this happens, we need to care about it because this has an impact on the individual citizens' lives. So we always want to think that UN is like so distant, so far away from individuals, but it's actually not, because once the state uses UN, this brings an impact on civil society, NGOs, community-based organizations. So the governments take the UN policy framework, brand with the UN logo, and then they're able to create like some sort of like a sense of legitimacy that can be used in their national security sector to repress political dissent. And then the other states look at this as like, okay, they're implementing UN policy agenda. What wrong can this cause? But at the end, it does. So that's what we have seen from the experience of civil society actors in many countries.
What we've seen is that states have used the UN as the platform, as Ali said, but to securitize more, to militarize more, to legitimize all that, right? And that is what they weaponize then in their national context. So the UN itself, of course, it's an institution of member states, but they've captured it to the point, particularly where counterterrorism is concerned, that until a few years ago, it was extremely difficult for civil society to even know what was going on in these processes or within these institutions, or to engage with these processes. And because they were not at all transparent. And there have been some positive changes over the last few years, which is why, given the global context now, and where we see that the merging of the war on terror and the war on drugs is increasing globally, such developments are taking place. It is very important that everyone cares about what goes on at the UN where counterterrorism is concerned, because that is a legitimate platform that states have, can easily use to weaponize that platform to justify, the rights violations and the repressive measures they take in their national context.
There's also a flip side, right? If the UN get this right on other policy areas like peacebuilding, like conflict prevention, it actually supports governments to do a better job. And so this is why we care about this area. We see there a huge area of potential harm. So we're trying to mitigate it against giving governments carte blanche to use a UN global framework to crack down on political opponents, to close civic space. But if we get this right, we also know that there's a positive, that approaches can be based on the rule of law. They can integrate gender. They can have human rights considerations. Whereas without that, they may not have. And so I think that's the really important point here. And that's why this is not just an area or a policy area where we would say this shouldn't happen whatsoever. We want to stop everything. This is why we're trying to engage.
I mean, in terms of peace building, wouldn't you say that increasingly states are also losing interest in things like peace building, also because it requires them to address the root causes, which is very difficult, because then you have to address the structural, systemic, economic, historical discrimination, etc. Whereas it is extremely easy to use the cloak of counterterrorism, and now most worryingly, this violent extremism, which is extremely broad and anything and everything falls within it. It is much easier for them, also because I think they feel it is linked, I think, to also, for instance, the growth of the military industrial complex. It is linked to growing authoritarianism, which means for states, this is a better option for them to consolidate power. It's a better option for them to make alliances with, other states to engage in dubious global activities. It is better for them because they profit from the military industrial complex. So that is, I think, what I see is that just they're just not interested. They would rather focus on this than peace building and addressing root causes.
And Bika, I think that's wonderfully said. And, I think if we're looking at what's been happening at the UN recently that people should care about, this is, I think, one of the critical things for us, is that peace building is being deprioritized, that human rights are being deprioritized, and that counterterrorism has risen. And research that Safe World have done, that Ali and myself have done together, where we've looked at different parts of the UN system and the UN counterterrorism architecture and studied these trends and seen that 25 years ago, the counterterrorism footprint of the UN was tiny. And then by 2015, with the plan of action from the Secretary General on preventing violent extremism through to the birth of the Office of Counterterrorism in 2017, we see all of these resources poured into this agenda, and we see certain priorities of states start to come through that means that this is a growth area, a huge growth area where peace building being pushed to the side. And as you say, the convenience factor for states is wonderful here. Counterterrorism frameworks are based on the fact that the problem lies with the terrorists. Peacebuilding frameworks often acknowledge that the root causes of conflict come from many different factors, some of which may come and be a root cause of state action. And that's an inconvenient truth for many states.
Well, I think, Jordan, you said something in the beginning, important. That the point that we're trying to raise here is not that UN shouldn't engage in security at all, but it should be cautiously engaging with the questions around security. So that once we speak about securitization, we so quickly sort of kind of come to the point that this whole thing wholesale is wrong. But it has to do it with its own principles and its own sort of normative standpoint. So what I mean by this is that where does UN sit? People's security should matter for the UN. Individual citizen security should matter for the UN. But what UN does is that it's prioritized the security of the states, security of the governments that are running the states, more so than the citizens. That's the fundamental problem that UN counterterrorism policy frameworks introduce to us. How does UN engage in counterterrorism is, I think, the current question. I think we passed the period where we can no longer say that UN should not engage in security, UN should no longer engage in counterterrorism. That's not really a realistic. What we can see is that UN is going to engage in counterterrorism and security matters, and maybe it should engage, but from a sort of a principle and critical point of view. The issue here is that when we look at the UN system, there are multiple UN entities engaging in counterterrorism. Some of them engage in counterterrorism work from a principle angle, some less so. And that's especially when we look at the UNODC's work that tries to integrate human rights principles or tries to integrate gender concerns. There are some positive signs. Not all great, not all done properly, but they are more positive in comparison to other entities. So these type of nuances really matter. But what we've seen in the last 10 years, 20 years, is that more money should be raised through the engagement in counterterrorism at the UN so that staff can maintain their positions, UN can maintain its budget or raise its budget. So that has been the wrong steps.
So, Ambika, what do you see as the drivers of these trends that Ali has mentioned? And what are you seeing within UNOCT, the UN Office for Counterterrorism?
I feel it's because it's counterterrorism or security you have in one silo, and then you have human rights in the other silo. And what we've seen in the past, well, definitely in the past few years, but even in the last 10 years, is that human rights has been deprioritized, even within the larger, broader international UN system, and certainly in national contexts within the UN, even in the UN country team. So, for instance, there was a review after the debacle that happened in Sri Lanka of what went wrong. That report is public. And that is what led to what's called the human rights upfront, the Secretary General's plan, which then disappeared. But what we see is the deprioritization. So even if we now have within UNOCT, for instance, a gender and human rights unit, how much of voice and traction does that unit have within the office? we have a human rights due diligence policy, but is every program being run through that policy? Are they reviewing? Is the human rights unit reviewing it? If they find problems with it and they make recommendations to the institutional hierarchy, is that taken into account? So the principled framework that Ali spoke of, it constitutes of these things. And what we have seen is that human rights has been deprioritized politically, institutionally, and particularly financially. And I think with UN 80, we're seeing it's disastrous. It's a bloodbath, is what someone from OHCHR told me. It's a bloodbath.
There is a belief in the civil society who are engaged in the UN counterterrorism. Bringing human rights will at least alleviate some of the problems. It will minimize the harm that counterterrorism policies, frameworks adopted at the UN cause in the national scene, national settings. This comes from a very realistic and very grounded perspective. However, the way this works out in the UN policy processes is that it's extremely tokenistic, performative embrace of the language of human rights. And that's what we have seen also in the research that we have done, is that human rights language is all over in all documents, all speeches created, written, or spoken at the UN Security Council. Every country, almost all nations, do recognize human rights matter in countering terrorism. However, the implications, there is not really a measurement or assessment of this, whether human rights are actually integrated in their counterterrorism policies and practices. So states will just make references to human rights, that human rights matter. We should integrate human rights principles into counterterrorism work. But in reality, the work on the ground is very, very far from what they say in their speeches. But I think there is a need to scrutinize when states say that we are integrating human rights principles, or gender, I would say the same thing for gender. What does that really mean? For this, we need to look at the practical implications, real consequences of counterterrorism policies and frameworks and practices.
I think that's a fantastic point. And actually, we'd said in some of our research that what the UN needs to shift towards is to see human rights and gender in relation to counterterrorism as a calling card of the UN system rather than as a compliance issue. And sometimes we see that it's a tick box, that gender language is instrumentalized, that women are used tokenistically, but we don't have a real recognition of the specific gendered harms. Any move to reject those things in future policy frameworks is an unserious position because we have the evidence, we have it documented. And so I think that that's something going to be really critical for the UN system moving forward. Are they going to stand up for their principles, or are they going to follow politicized moves by certain states?
You know, when we speak of the UN, I think there are two separate parts of it, right? One is what Ali spoke about as also the political organs, where you have all these resolutions that pay lip service to human rights. And then we have the UN agencies. I think we need to talk about accountability of those UN agencies. Why is it that it's not a calling card? Why is it that it's just a tick the box exercise? And who is holding them accountable? Is there an internal oversight mechanism for these UN counterterrorism entities? How about transparency? Right? How transparent are they in terms of reviewing a program, assessing a program in line with the human rights due diligence policy? So, where states are concerned, accountability might be slightly more difficult because, what goes on in the Security Council or the Human Rights Council, our ability to influence might be limited. But I think we really need to focus on the UN agencies, which are run through taxpayer funds. And they are sort of the standard bearers, right, of all these values, not really the member states or the political entities. So what are the standard bearers doing? So if we speak about UN 80, I think it's not about cutting funding and chopping positions, but it is about internal accountability and transparency, particularly the UN counterterrorism architecture.
So let me pick up on that point then, Ambika. And for those that don't know who are listening, and I mean, why don't you know this, but you should know this, but UN 80 is the reform initiative happening this year at the UN. The Secretary General is framing this as a huge reform for the system, but really this is a cost-cutting exercise. And that's mainly because the United States government has made it very clear that it's not going to continue to fund the UN at the level that it currently is. And so what we're seeing really is not a strategic reform, we're seeing a race to the bottom to try and get necessary cuts. And as Ambika has said, human rights is one of the things that's going to be most affected. Now, all agencies have to have certain cuts, but one of the biggest worries for us is that the other parts of the system that we actually think are necessary to make sure that counterterrorism policy at the UN is protected and there are guardrails in places like OHCHR or UN Women, those specific posts that are focusing on counterterrorism and trying to add that gender expertise and human rights expertise, they're going to be on the cutting floor. And that's just a bad outcome for the system. What do you see over the next 12 months that you think is going to be really critical here? So UN 80 is one of them. The Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy is going to be reviewed for the 9th time next year. That Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy started in 2006, so we're going to have a 20-year review effectively. Where do you see this going? What do you think we should be worried about? Is there any cause for optimism?
What do we see? As you said, yes. So in December, we have the mandate renewal of the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and the US is the pen holder. So I suppose, I think it was you, Jordan, you used the phrase canary in the coal mine. So that is what it is. So that is where we will see where the next 12 months will go as to what happens with the mandate renewal. Will it just be a technical rollover, or will it be more? Will they want to revisit it? Then, of course, we have the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, the upcoming review. And of course, the concerns there are, we're not pushing, I think mostly everyone is like, we're not pushing something new. What we're working towards is safeguarding what exists, because there is concern, given the global trends, particularly in relation to things like gender, that it might result in them being cut from the strategies. And we're still trying to figure out the lay of the land where member states are concerned, even in terms of position. So, for instance, the merging of the war on terror and the war on drugs. So we are working with, the Global CSO Coalition on Counterterrorism and Human Rights is now engaging with the network on drug policy. And we are trying to figure out how to do our advocacy in relation to the references in the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, references to drugs, because the concern is, given the global trajectory, given where the US is going, will there be attempts for, more repressive, more militarized, securitized language? So that, I think, is, as far as I see the next 12 months, that is where we're moving. And of course, where UN 80 is concerned, I'm deeply, deeply disturbed and concerned about the cuts to OHCHR in particular, because right now I think it is about 15%. It was supposed to be 20, but I think they've negotiated it down to 15% again. So all these key bodies within the UN structure, which are the monitoring mechanisms for state adherence to human rights standards, they're already weakened, right? So by the time UN 80 is over, my concern is what will be left.
And that's a worry. And throw in the potential collision course that the Global Counterterrorism Strategy review process is heading towards next year, and you really could see some unraveling of some critical issues in the UN counterterrorism architecture. Last time the Global Counterterrorism Strategy review happened was in the summer of 2023. We had a slightly different geopolitical reality. Consensus was very, very close to being broken. And for the longest time, consensus has been a key defining feature of this architecture. It's funny that actually there's so many differences across the UN system and the UN member states, but consensus happens a surprising amount of time in General Assembly resolutions.
And I think it's important to flag here for anyone who's not so familiar with the UN system, just how important consensus is. We're talking about a decision that is adopted without an official vote because no state raises a formal objection. So it's not saying that they agree with every word of a specific text, But consensus at the UN signals a broad buy-in and a willingness to move forwards without delaying the process.
And this has been an area that there's always been a pride that there's been consensus. Now, one of the negative impacts of that is that often that means the lowest common denominator on issues that other stakeholders like civil society care about, where we're trying to add more thoughtful consideration of some critical things that have not made it into the security architecture. But the positive of that is when it is grounded in rule of law, international humanitarian law, human rights, this presents those guardrails that we've spoke about at the beginning of the podcast. Now, I think it's really, really unlikely that we have all member states agree to a strategy next year.
So as we're looking ahead to the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy process in 2026, next year, what do you see as the really tricky issues?
I think we're going to have a vote, and I think there's going to be some really contentious issues. States over the last couple of reviews have consistently been trying to put in new threat language about different definitions of what constitutes terrorism or what constitutes a violent extremism. That is going to come back. That's going to rear its ugly head, and I think that's going to be really divisive. As Ambika, you've said, some states might try and put drug policy in and raise the issue of, I say this with inverted commas, narco-terrorism. And that's just going to be the tip of the iceberg. This is going to be a huge fight. And I think this is going to be a really negative outcome for the UN system. On UN 80, I think the proof will be in the pudding of where states really negotiate at the end of this year on those budgets. And I think show me what you care about by showing me your budget is a really critical thing. And if this Secretary General is a champion for human rights, then we will see that by the end of this year. And if we see some states standing up for it, we'll also know that it's a priority moving forward.
I think I just want to sort of bring the conversation into a sort of zoom out and see, because the issue here is that the challenge is technical in the global counterterrorism strategy mostly. It's political, it's extremely political, but there's a lot of technical problems. What happens is that global counterterrorism strategy pulls people into a narrow discussion about rhetoric, language, or what term that's been used, what sort of new threats has been integrated into that. And that's essential work that has to be done. And it's very important that we engage in this work. But I think the bigger problem here that we need to see this as a system-wide problem. Because once we are in the global counterterrorism strategy review processes, we can only think about day-to-day policing the language used by the certain states. They are trying to integrate problematic, narco-terrorism or religiously motivated terrorism, etc., to broaden the definitions of terrorism that can be misused in the national legislations. This point has been there, and it's probably going to stick with us. But I think what we need to see here is that the global counterterrorism strategy or United Nations counterterrorism architecture has system-wide implications. And these are the things that could be discussed in the UN 80. If United Nations wants to go through a transformation to renew itself, needs to think seriously about the United Nations counterterrorism architecture. So for this, we need to sort of see how UN counterterrorism impacts development, humanitarian work, and also inclusion-focused agendas like WPS, Women, Peace and Security Agenda, YPS, Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. I don't really see critical discussions about the UN counterterrorism's impacts on peace and security work of the UN. In the circles, in the ecosystems where YPS, Women, Peace and Security, and Youth, Peace and Security discuss. If we want to recalibrate UN counterterrorism architecture, we need to broaden the conversation about counterterrorism impact on the UN system. And this requires other actors to actually engage with this subject rather than avoiding it and stay in their comfort zone of inclusion-focused agendas. There are contradictions between these agendas and the UNCT architecture. And sometimes states use these inclusion agendas to broaden UN counterterrorism frameworks. And I think that's what we can see when we look at the language used by the states. When they are integrating gender into CT policies and frameworks and programs, that's again come from a performative angle where they are able to convince advocates of women, peace and security agenda to approve counterterrorism should be essential part of UN. One of the major reasons why these agendas do not become impactful, I think, is the growth of the UN counterterrorism policies. Because UN counterterrorism architecture dominated the peace and security pillar in the last 10 years. Whether we want to ignore or focus, this is what happened.
Ali, I think it's a really great challenge you just laid down there, and a really important point for us to be considering, both as civil society, but for states as well, when they're engaging in this process, to try not get lost in the weeds of a review process and the words, but actually to look back at the big picture and look at the forest. And to see, what do we want this UN system moving forward to look like? Where do we want counterterrorism to be in this system? What level do we want that to be at? And I think sometimes we all do get lost in our day-to-day and in those negotiation processes. But the fact of the matter remains is that the critical work of the UN should not be counterterrorism. That should not be what it's known for in peace and security. And the more and more counterterrorism is imbued into the system, the worse it is for the system. Do I want counterterrorism to exist at the UN? Yes, I do, actually. I'd like them to provide some policy guidance to member states that need it. I would like them to make sure that the rule of law, human rights, international humanitarian law are upheld in state policies on counterterrorism. Do I want the UN to be programming on counterterrorism all around the world with governments where we don't know what's actually happening, where instead of framing the intervention around violence, they frame it around extremism? I don't want that at all. And I don't think the UN system should want that either. I think that's bad news for the UN.
UN80 presents to us an opportunity to burn it all down, in the sense of not just burn it down, but to rebuild it. But my question once again is, yes, we should not get caught up in the weeds, and yes, we need to think about the broader picture, but are member states interested in that? That is my concern. And what we see globally now is that they are not. So then what do we do? How do we address it? I think that is the big elephant in the room for us. And I think maybe even the UN structures, part of the UN counterterrorism architecture, they see member states like this and they're like, oh, this is just too difficult. Why don't I just, service the member state? And that way I get to exist and, everything goes on. A comment about the Women, Peace and Security agenda is that I would say what we need to do is to reclaim the Women, Peace and Security agenda, because we have seen the WPS agenda also being militarized. And there is capture of that by the UN counterterrorism discourse, processes, architecture. And this, I think, we do also by going back to first principles. And by first principles, I mean the treaty bodies. I've always had an issue with the WPS agenda because I'm like, you're talking about a Security Council resolution, whereas you have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which creates hard legal duties upon member states. And also the CEDAW committee came up with General Recommendation 30, which is on women and armed conflict, which is much broader, deeper in detail than the WPS agenda. The WPS agenda also does not address or question the very patriarchal, militarized structures. It completely ignores that and says, how do we work within it? But I feel like we need to also talk about the broader patriarchal, securitized, militarized structures, because if not, our work is not going to be impactful. And that may be why we've also not been so successful, because this comes back to my core point about member states or civil society. We don't really address the root causes because it is just too difficult.
So 2026 is going to be a really pivotal moment for counterterrorism policy at the UN. Ambika, what is the outlook from your point of view, and what do you see as the opportunities for positive change?
The outlook, it's rather scary and a bit bleak. I think we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge the obstacles we're going to face in order to strategize smartly and to build coalitions and to try to have some impact. So as Jordan said, the negotiation on the GCTS, or the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, is going to be difficult and fractious and complex. So in that, how do we gain space? For instance, coalitions that have been working on this, like the CSO Coalition on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, they have some space. And what they should do, and what we're trying to do also, is to work with other coalitions, like, for instance, the Drug Policy Coalition, because the CT and Human Rights Coalition has relationships with certain member states. The Drug Policy coalition has relationships with different member states. I think right now what we also need to do is work across networks, pool our resources, particularly the information we have, the relationships we have. I think that is critical. And where UN 80 is concerned, I think we need to put more pressure to impress upon the Secretary General and the committee that he has set up that we need to have a far more in-depth, structural policy conversation to ensure that this isn't merely a cost-cutting exercise, because then what will be left might not be fit for purpose. And I think the people in positions of power in the UN structure, it also benefits them to have something fit for purpose. And although member states may not realize it now, it does, because even those who are critical of the UN and do not want the UN, there are certain times like humanitarian crisis, the UN does play a role even in those contexts and in those countries. So once again, I would say the mandate renewal of CTED will tell us, I suppose, also where we are headed. And then it's about building coalition, sharing resources, sharing knowledge. We need to acknowledge that this is going to be a very difficult, long haul. So we just need to dig our heels and do the hard work.
And Ali, what's the outlook from your perspective?
When I talk about UN, I was always like, this young person and a youth speaking about UN or like engage in youth-related issues. But now I'm becoming a bit older that I remember UN 75 and UN 70. And what I want to say is that, yes, it's very important and it's very critical, definitely, everything we do in the next year. Always. It's like always, that's the feeling that UN wants to give to us. And I want to say that people who are in that ecosystem is more concerned than the rest of the world. UN 80 matters, but not for the people really. People don't really care about it. UN is not really popular. I do research with young people. Young people don't care about it. Definitely don't care about it. And they will not care about this because UN isn't really touching in their life, or UN doesn't really defend their rights when it comes to, global politics. UN just does this in its words, in its rhetoric, in its media engagement, in social media, but not when it comes to holding states accountable. That's not what UN does. I remember we had very similar discussions on UN 75, and there's going to be UN 85. And this is going to just continue as it is. This is how states treat UN, in my opinion. I don't want to be alarmist in the way that, what's going to come next, because UN has gone through similar challenges, I think, especially in the Cold War era. There has been more difficult times that UN gone through. UN will survive. But UN will survive because it has strong principles. It has strong foundational reasons why it's established. It's not going to survive because states are invested in running an organizational that's trying to manage international conflicts. It's going to survive because there are really good foundational principles that build United Nations. And that's going to be the part that's valuable. That will be the goal for the UN to stick to in going through transformation in the next years, when it's trying to, size down its agencies, its programs, etc. That's how I think about it, at least.
Ali, I think that's a really good reminder for everybody of not to be stuck in thinking that this matters for everyone. And we hear this in our programming all around the world when we ask people how they view the UN. Most do view it with disdain. And a lot of that has been because trust has been lost from various different incidents where the UN did not stand up for people's rights or people in conflict. And so I think that's a really good reminder. A final note maybe for us on next year, I think it will be really critical. I think one of the biggest hopes we have is that the member states who do know how counterterrorism can be used negatively and have in the past stood up for issues related to gender, human rights, transparency, accountability, we really hope that those member states will actually put some political will into doing that again. And that's something that isn't a guarantee. But the negative outcome of them not doing that would be really disastrous, we think, for the future of the UN system. And if we do want to avoid a securitized counterterrorism architecture that goes around the world running programs that people don't want, but states might find convenient, then we really need those states to stand up.
Thanks, Ambika, Ali, and Jordan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Warpod from Safer World. This series was produced by Andy O'Connor and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. You can listen to all previous episodes and catch up on the latest releases wherever you get your podcasts by searching for and following Warpod. You can also find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at war_pod and at saferworld. And to find out more about our work, visit saferworld-global.org.